Sometimes life doesn't take from you to punish you. It takes to prepare you for something bigger, something that requires an emptier heart to fill. The hospital hallway smelled like bleach and unanswered prayers. Machines hummed their cold lullabies while I sat in the corner of room 214, holding the hand of a man I had known for 25 years and was somehow losing by the minute. His name was Calvin Hayes, my husband, my first love, and in many ways, my biggest teacher, though not always in lessons I wanted to learn. The doctor had said the words hours earlier, but my heart still refused to translate them. Massive internal bleeding, little chance of recovery. I remember nodding like a polite student, as if my composure could earn him a second chance. But there are no makeup exams for fate. Calvin had been on his way home from a double shift at the auto plant when a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. One wrong lane, one shattered windshield, and everything we'd built came crashing down before dinner. I had gotten the call from a stranger, a paramedic with a voice too gentle for the news he carried. I remember the drive to the hospital, rain slicing through the night, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that later I'd find small crescent moons where my nails had dug into my palms. When I arrived, they were already cutting off his wedding ring. We'd been married since I was 25 and he was 27. Back then, he had dreams that could fill a city skyline, to open his own repair shop, to buy a house big enough for laughter to echo. I had dreams too, though smaller, quieter ones, a warm kitchen, kids who'd know they were loved, a husband who'd come home at a reasonable hour. But life, as it does, replaced dreams with duties. Bills piled up, jobs came and went, and our love, once loud and effortless, learned to whisper between grocery lists and night shifts. Still, I never doubted him, not once. Because when you've walked through poverty, loss, and sleepless years together, you start believing love itself is a kind of armor. Now that armor lay broken before me. The monitors beside his bed beeped in uneven rhythm, like a song that no longer knew its melody. His skin, once warm and strong, looked pale beneath the fluorescent light. I rubbed his arm gently, afraid to let go, afraid to hold on. "Calvin," I whispered, my voice cracking like an old floorboard. "You can rest now, baby. You've done enough." He didn't respond. Just a small movement in his fingers, or maybe that was my imagination trying to give me mercy. The nurse came in, a young woman with kind eyes who spoke softly, as if afraid her words might break me. "Mrs. Hayes, it's time." I had seen death before. As a nurse's aide in my 20s, I'd held hands that turned cold. But nothing prepares you for the chill of your own husband's skin. They say when someone you love dies, a part of you dies with them. I think that's a lie. A part of you stays, but it's the part that remembers how to ache. I signed papers I couldn't read, heard condolences I couldn't absorb. Someone pressed tissues into my hand, someone else asked about funeral homes. The world kept moving, indifferent and cruelly efficient. When I finally stepped outside, dawn was breaking, the kind of gray light that doesn't promise a sunrise, just the end of darkness. My son Devin called from his college dorm, his voice thick with shock. "Mama, I'm coming home." My daughter Kayla didn't speak. She just cried, soft and endless like rain hitting glass. I should have cried too, but tears require permission, and I hadn't given myself any yet. 2 days later, I sat in the lawyer's office, a beige room that smelled of old paper and pity. The man behind the desk wore glasses too big for his face. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I'm afraid your husband's estate is complicated." Complicated. That's how they say empty in professional language. Turns out, Calvin had taken out loans to keep our house from foreclosure. Credit cards I didn't know about. A second mortgage signed during one of his silent nights. The total debt could have bought us another house, one built on lies instead of love. I remember gripping the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. "So you're telling me," I said slowly, "that I buried a man who left me with nothing but bills?" The lawyer hesitated. Not nothing, Mrs. Hayes. You still have your home, for now. For now, 2 words that sounded like a countdown. That night, after everyone had gone, I sat alone in our kitchen. The casserole dishes from neighbors sat untouched. His favorite mug, the one that said world's okayest mechanic, still waited in the sink. I stared at the empty chair across from me and imagined him there, smiling like always, promising that everything would work out. But the silence had weight now. It pressed against my chest until breathing felt optional. I thought about our last conversation, nothing profound, just him asking if I'd seen his blue jacket. I told him it was in the laundry. That's the thing about final moments, they never announce themselves. They hide in the ordinary. I looked at the stack of bills on the counter, the unpaid mortgage, the funeral receipts. My name was on every one of them. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just alone. I was responsible. The moonlight fell across the wedding photo hanging on our wall. In it, we were young, full of bad decisions and good intentions. I walked over, ran my fingers over the glass, and whispered, "You promised we'd grow old together." Then I caught my reflection, tired eyes, wrinkled hands, a woman who looked older than 50, not because of age, but because of carrying too much for too long. That's when something inside me shifted, not anger, not yet, just an understanding. No one was coming to save me, not Calvin, not luck, not miracles. If I was going to survive, I'd have to rebuild from ashes that weren't even mine. At midnight, I walked out to the porch. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies your thoughts. Across the street, Dorsey's porch light flickered like a heartbeat. Somewhere, a dog barked, restless. I tilted my head to the sky. The stars looked cold and far away. I had lost my husband. But more than that, I had lost the version of myself that believed life was something you could plan. Still, in that stillness, a voice inside whispered maybe faith, maybe defiance. "You're still here, Monica. You're still breathing. Start from there." So I did. The next morning, I put on my old work shoes, packed Calvin's jacket in a box, and opened the door to whatever was left of my life. That night, I buried my husband and the life I thought I'd have. The sun rose just the same, careless, golden, almost cruel, spilling across the kitchen counter where the funeral brochures still lay. The world doesn't stop when your heart does. It just expects you to keep moving, like a clock that refuses to break even when the hands tremble. I went back to work a week after the funeral, not because I was ready, but because the mortgage didn't care about grief. The diner on 8th Street needed extra hands, and I had bills with my name screaming on them. I tied my apron, slipped on shoes that had lost their shine years ago, and told myself I could do this one plate at a time. The first day back, people stared. Not in cruelty, but in that awkward, sympathetic way folks do when they don't know whether to say I'm sorry or just pretend everything's fine. So they overtipped, smiled too wide, and whispered when I walked past. The smell of burnt coffee and fried bacon filled the air. I moved between tables like a shadow, polite, invisible, and necessary. Around noon, a couple walked in, laughing, holding hands. The woman wore a diamond so large it caught the light like a confession. I caught myself staring for a second too long. Once, I'd had that kind of laughter, not the wealth, but the ease. Now every laugh I heard in that diner sounded like a language I'd forgotten. Devin came home that night, carrying the kind of silence that weighed more than luggage. He'd quit college for now, he said, though the "for now" sounded like forever when it left his mouth. He talked about big opportunities and investment partners, but the only thing he invested in was excuses. "Mom, I can help us," he said, pulling out his phone to show me some crypto scheme I couldn't even pronounce. "If you just let me use part of Dad's insurance check." "There is no check," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "There's debt, Devin, debt and rent and bills that don't stop because your father did." He looked at me like I'd betrayed him, like I was supposed to produce money from thin air just to keep his dream alive. So what? We just keep being broke forever, he snapped. I wanted to tell him broke isn't forever, but entitlement might be. Instead, I just said softly, we keep surviving, son. That's what we do. He stormed out, the front door slamming like a punctuation mark on disappointment. Kayla was different, quieter. She buried herself in her college books, taking extra shifts at the library just to afford textbooks. She called me every night before bed, even when she had nothing to say. Sometimes we just sit on the phone in silence, two women pretending everything was okay. But I could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the way she swallowed words she didn't want me to worry about. She was my gentle child, the one who apologized for things that weren't her fault. Mom, she said one evening, do you ever get tired of being strong? I thought about that question for a long time. Finally, I said, every day, baby, but being tired doesn't mean we stop walking. A month later, my second job started night cleaning at a downtown office building. The hallways smelled of lemon polish and ambition. I'd mop floors while watching the lights from expensive offices fade one by one, wondering what it felt like to leave work knowing someone else handled your messes. One night, while emptying trash bins, I looked out from the 10th floor window. Across the street, a glass tower glittered Coal Industries. I didn't know then that behind those windows sat the man who would one day change everything for me. At the time, all I saw were people in suits, too busy to notice the woman scrubbing their footprints from marble floors. I remember whispering to myself, "You're still here, Monica. Keep breathing, keep going." Faith, I learned, sometimes sounds like self-talk in a janitor's closet. By December, the debt collectors had found their rhythm. Calls came in like clockwork, morning, noon, and evening, polite voices reading scripts that turned mercy into math. I learned how to stretch $1 until it begged for mercy. Dinner became rice, beans, and stories about better days. And still, I smiled, because that's what women like me are taught to do, smile so the world doesn't see how close we are to falling apart. Then, one evening, a stranger walked into the diner, tall, silver-haired, wearing a navy suit that didn't belong anywhere near sticky floors and fluorescent lights. He sat in booth 3 alone with a newspaper and a glass of water. I recognized him immediately. His face had been on billboards downtown. Richard Cole, the construction magnate, the kind of man who lived in the world I cleaned. When I brought him his coffee, he looked up and smiled faintly. "You seem too calm for this chaos," he said, gesturing around the noisy room. "Calm's cheaper than therapy," I replied before I could stop myself. He laughed, not the polite kind, but the real kind that starts in the chest. The next day he came back, same booth, same smile. This time he asked for pie, and when I told him we were out, he ordered one anyway, said, "I trust you'll figure it out." So I did, went into the kitchen, found leftover crust, and made something up that vaguely resembled pie. He said it was the best he'd ever had. He even left a $100 tip. A week later, I found his wallet under booth 3, left behind, maybe on purpose, maybe not. Inside was everything you'd expect: platinum cards, crisp bills, a photo of a woman with kind eyes. His late wife, maybe. I could have kept the money. God knows I needed it. But something in me couldn't. So I drove all the way to his office the next morning, clutching that wallet like it was proof of who I still was. The receptionist looked at me like I'd wandered in from another planet. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, "but I have something that belongs to Mr. Cole." When Richard saw me standing there, his eyes softened. He took the wallet, glanced inside, then back at me. "Most people wouldn't have returned this." "I'm not most people," I said simply. He nodded, thoughtful. "No, I suppose you're not." As I turned to leave, he called out, "Mrs. Hayes?" I stopped, surprised he'd remembered my name tag. "Next time you make that pie," he said, "save me a slice." That night after work, I sat by the window with a cup of coffee gone cold. Devin hadn't come home again. Kayla texted that she was studying late. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the fridge and the ticking of the old wall clock Calvin had fixed years ago. 2 jobs, one heart barely holding together. Sometimes I'd catch myself whispering to Calvin as if he were still there. "Do you see me, baby? I'm trying. I swear I'm trying." But the truth was I was drowning just gracefully enough that no one noticed. Still, something had shifted since the day I returned that wallet. It wasn't hope exactly. It was smaller, quieter, like the first spark before a fire you're not sure you can keep alive. And though I didn't know it yet, that small act of honesty would open a door I never saw coming. The next morning began like every other: alarm at 5:15, shoes by the door, silence heavy enough to have a texture. I stood in front of the mirror, tying my hair back, noticing the fine silver lines that had crept into it this past year. Grief ages you faster than time ever could. When I stepped outside, the sky was the color of unwashed denim. The bus came late, the air was sharp, and I told myself again that tired didn't mean finished. Somewhere between the diner and the office building where I cleaned floors, I started to believe it. By noon, the diner was crowded. The coffee pot hissed, the register dinged like a heartbeat, and there, in booth 3, sat Richard Cole, right on time. Same suit. Same calm expression that looked out of place among the chaos of working people on their lunch breaks. When I approached, he smiled. "Mrs. Hayes, I was hoping you'd be here. You saved me from an embarrassing day yesterday." "I'm glad you got your wallet back," I said, setting down his coffee. "Would have been a shame to lose that picture." His eyes softened. "That was my wife, Evelyn. She passed 3 years ago." He paused as if waiting to see whether I'd flinch. "Cancer." "I'm sorry," I said quietly. He nodded. "I used to think grief fades. It doesn't, it just changes shape. One day it's a storm, the next it's a fog. You still can't see through it, you just get used to walking blind." For a man surrounded by wealth, he sounded poor in all the same places I was. Maybe that's what drew me to linger at his table longer than usual, just talking. He asked about the diner, about my children, about how long I'd lived in the city. I told him bits, never too much, never too personal. Pride's a funny thing. Even when you're drowning, you don't want anyone to know how deep the water is. Before leaving, he placed his card on the table. "If you ever need a second job that doesn't smell like burnt coffee, call me." I laughed, tucking the card into my apron. "I'm not exactly corporate material, Mr. Cole." He smiled. Neither was I once. A week passed before I called, not because I wanted to, but because the electric company had mailed its final notice in red letters bold enough to feel like shouting. When I finally dialed, a woman's voice answered, crisp, professional, expensive. "Cole Industries, this is Veronica speaking." "I'm calling for Mr. Cole," I said. "This is Monica Hayes." There was a pause long enough to make me wonder if she'd hung up. One moment. Her tone dripped suspicion, like she'd just taken a bite of something she didn't trust. Richard's voice came through seconds later, warm and easy. "Mrs. Hayes, I was beginning to think you'd lost my number." "Just been busy," I said. "You mentioned a job?" "Come by tomorrow morning," he said. "My driver will pick you up. I have a proposal." I almost said no. Pride again. But the red letters on that electric bill were louder than my ego. The next morning, a black sedan pulled up to my street. The neighbors peeked through curtains like I'd just won the lottery. Inside the car, everything smelled of leather and money. The driver didn't speak, just nodded when I said good morning. When we turned into the gates of Cole Manor, I swear my breath caught. The driveway curved through a garden big enough to hide my whole neighborhood inside it. The mansion itself looked like something from a magazine. White stone, columns, windows that stretched like ambition. I smoothed my thrift store blouse, feeling like a child in a grown-up costume. Richard met me at the front door. "Welcome," he said simply, as if inviting me into something more than a house. "Come, I want to show you something." He led me through hallways that smelled faintly of lemon and history. Every surface gleamed. Portraits of serious people hung on the walls, men in suits, women in pearls. I recognized none of them but felt their eyes follow me just the same. We stopped in the sunroom, where morning light poured in through high glass panes. "Evelyn used to run this place like an orchestra," Richard said. "Since she passed, it's been quiet, too quiet. My staff keeps things clean but lifeless." He turned to me. "I don't need another cleaner, Monica. I need a presence. Someone who understands what it means to keep something alive after loss." I frowned. "I'm not sure what that means." "It means," he said gently, "that I'd like to hire you not just to manage the house, but to make it feel like a home again. Flexible hours, good pay, and no grease stains." I hesitated. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said, his gaze steady. "You returned something valuable when you didn't have to. That tells me everything." When I got home that evening, Devin was waiting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. "Whose car was that dropping you off?" "New job," I said, opening the fridge. "Better pay." He raised an eyebrow. "Working for some rich guy now? That doesn't sound safe." "It's work, Devin, not a fairy tale." He laughed dryly. "Yeah, sure. Just don't forget people like that don't help folks like us unless they want something back." I didn't answer, but his words stuck to me like humidity in August. My first week at the mansion felt like walking on eggshells covered in silk. The staff were polite but distant, like they couldn't decide if I was help or charity. And then there was her, Veronica Cole, Richard's daughter. Tall, elegant, mid-30s, and sharper than a diamond edge. She introduced herself with a handshake that felt more like a test. "My father tends to collect projects," she said with a smile too thin to be kind. "I hope you're not another one." "I'm just here to work," I said. "Good," she replied. "Then work quietly." She left the room smelling like Chanel and disapproval. Still, I stayed, because for the first time in months, the money was steady, the air felt light, and I could sleep without counting overdue notices in my head. One afternoon, while arranging fresh flowers in the hallway, I heard Richard at the piano. The notes were clumsy, hesitant. I peeked inside the music room. "I didn't know you played," I said. He chuckled. "Evelyn tried to teach me once, said every man needs to learn patience. I failed the lesson." I smiled. "You're improving. That's kind of you, but you're a terrible liar," he said. Then he looked up at me, his expression softer. "Do you ever miss music in your house, Monica?" "All the time," I said, "but it's hard to hear anything when bills are screaming louder." He laughed, then sighed. "You remind me of Evelyn. She had your kind of strength, quiet but unbreakable." There was something in his tone that scared me a little, not because it was romantic, but because it was sincere. People don't usually see women like me that way. By the end of the month, I'd learned his coffee order by heart. 1 sugar, no cream, always before 8 a.m. He'd learned that I hated leaving dishes in the sink. And somehow, in the middle of grief and work and exhaustion, something gentle had started to grow. Not love. Not yet. Just kindness, the kind that happens when two lonely people stop pretending they are fine. Still, every time I passed Veronica in the hallway, her eyes followed me like a warning. One morning, she stopped me near the staircase, voice low and deliberate. "You seem nice, Mrs. Hayes, but don't mistake my father's loneliness for affection. He has a generous heart and a fragile one. Don't take advantage of either." I met her gaze steadily. "With respect, Ms. Cole, I don't take what isn't mine." She smiled faintly, almost impressed. "We'll see." That night, I stood by my bedroom window, watching the city lights flicker beyond the trees. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. Maybe that's how friendship starts, not with promises, but with presence. And as I lay down, I whispered the same words I'd said since Calvin died, though this time they felt different. "I'm still here." Only now, it didn't sound like a plea. It sounded like the beginning of something new. People think silence is peaceful. But in a house like that, a mansion filled with history and ghosts, silence isn't peace. It's judgment. It listens when you speak too loudly. It watches when you don't belong. Every morning, I arrived before sunrise. The hallways glowed gold with early light, bouncing off marble floors that could have bought my whole street twice over. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dillard, nodded curtly when I came in. She'd been with the Coles for 20 years and had the posture of someone who served more than cleaned. My first task was always the same: open the curtains in the east wing. Each window was heavy with velvet and secrets. Behind them stretched manicured gardens that looked like they'd never known a storm. Sometimes, I'd catch myself thinking how unfair it was, how some people inherited serenity while others inherited debt. "Morning, Mrs. Hayes," came a voice one day behind me. I turned to find Veronica, dressed in beige cashmere and the kind of diamonds that whisper old money. Her smile was a weapon, polished, precise. "Good morning, Ms. Cole," I said. She sipped her coffee, never breaking eye contact. "Father's fond of you, that's rare. He doesn't let people in easily." "I'm just doing my job." "Of course," she said, though her tone said otherwise. Still, I'd be careful. My father has a soft spot for tragic stories. He tends to mistake pity for affection. I kept my expression steady. "I'm not here for anyone's affection, Ms. Cole." "Good," she said, her smile fading into something colder. "Then you'll fit right in." When she left, the scent of her perfume lingered, sharp, citrus, expensive. It stayed in my throat long after she was gone. Later that afternoon, I found Richard in the study surrounded by papers, his reading glasses hanging low on his nose. The room smelled of old books and bourbon. He looked up when I entered. "Ah, Monica, come in, I was just thinking about you." That sentence startled me more than it should have. "Everything all right, Mr. Cole?" He leaned back, smiling faintly. "You've done more for this house in 3 weeks than the entire staff in 3 years. It feels alive again. I can't thank you enough." "It's just polish and flowers," I said quietly. "No," he replied, "it's warmth, that's rarer." I changed the subject before gratitude turned into something else. "The West Wing needs new drapes. The fabric's sun-faded." He nodded, scribbling a note. "Take care of it. Whatever you need, the account's open." His trust was disarming. But beneath it, I sensed loneliness so deep it could drown anyone who stayed too close. Every Friday, Richard hosted small lunches for his board members, men with heavy watches and heavier egos. My job was to serve quietly, stay invisible, but they saw me not as Monica, but as the help. "New face," one of them said, smirking. "Cole, you're upgrading your staff, I see." Their laughter was low, cruel. Richard's expression hardened. "That's enough, Paul." I wanted to shrink into the wallpaper, but I stood tall instead. I'd scrubbed too many floors to bow to men like that. When they left, Richard found me clearing the table. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "Some people think money buys manners. It doesn't." "It's fine," I replied, stacking plates. "You can't buy respect either." He chuckled softly. "You remind me of Evelyn. She never took nonsense from anyone." At the mention of his late wife, something shifted in the air, softer, sadder. I saw the portrait of her on the wall, a graceful woman with eyes like steady rain. "She was beautiful," I said. "She was kind," he replied, "and far too patient with me." There was a silence that wasn't awkward, just full, two people remembering different kinds of loss. By February, I'd learned the mansion's rhythms. Richard worked late in his study. Veronica left for charity luncheons that looked more like power games. The staff spoke in whispers, and me, I moved through the rooms like a song no one remembered the words to. One evening, after everyone had gone, I walked through the gallery hall. The paintings stared down from gilded frames, ancestors in oil and judgment. I stopped at one of Richard and Evelyn, younger, laughing, frozen in a life that no longer existed. For a moment, I saw Calvin and myself reflected there, the early days when we believed love was enough to pay the bills, when we still thought struggle was temporary. I felt tears threatening and quickly looked away. Beautiful, isn't it? Richard's voice made me jump. He stood at the end of the hallway, hands in his pockets. She looks happy, I said. She was. This house made her happy. After she died, I couldn't walk through it for months. I thought about selling it. Why didn't you? He smiled sadly. Because every corner still smelled like her. Selling it felt like losing her twice. We stood there, the distance between us filled with all the words neither of us could say, about love, about loss, about how grief sometimes feels like a second marriage you never asked for. Over the next weeks, our conversations grew more frequent. He'd ask about my children, I'd ask about his business. We found comfort in talking about everything except ourselves. Sometimes, while serving his tea, I'd catch him watching me, not the way men watch women, but the way lonely people look at company they don't want to lose. Still, I kept my boundaries neat like folded linens, but Veronica noticed. One evening, as I left the house, her car pulled up beside me. The tinted window rolled down and her voice slid out, smooth as glass. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, "I'll make this simple. My father's generous. It's easy to mistake his kindness for something else. Don't." I met her gaze. "I respect your father, M.S. Cole." "Good, then respect his reputation too." The window rolled up and she drove off, leaving exhaust and warning in the air. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I sat by the window, looking out at the city lights beyond my modest neighborhood. My reflection stared back, a woman caught between two worlds, one of survival, one of luxury. I wasn't sure where I belonged anymore. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of walls, tall, shining, unbreakable. On one side stood me, on the other, the life I never thought I'd glimpse. Between us, only glass clear enough to see through, thick enough to keep me out. The next morning, as I arrived at the mansion, Mrs. Dillard handed me an envelope. "From Mr. Cole," she said. Inside was a note in his handwriting. "Monica, thank you for bringing life back into this home. I've arranged something special. Meet me in the garden at 6. I felt my stomach twist with nerves. When I stepped into the garden that evening, the sun was setting, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Richard stood by the fountain, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I wanted to show you something," he said. He pointed to a new section of the garden, benches, lights, and a bronze plaque that read, "Evelyn's Place for everyone who loved and lost." "I built it in her memory," he said, "but I never opened it to the public. Evelyn believed beauty should be shared, not locked away. I think she would have liked you." The kindness in his voice wrapped around me like a blanket I hadn't asked for. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," I said softly, "but I'm just here to do my job." "Maybe," he replied, "but sometimes, Monica, the right people show up for reasons bigger than work." When I got home that night, Devin was waiting again. His tone was cold. "You've been spending a lot of time with that man. What's he giving you, Mom? Charity or attention?" I stared at him, too stunned to speak. "You think I'm proud of this?" he continued, "watching my mother play house for some rich guy who pities her." My voice rose before I could stop it. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. Everything I do is to keep a roof over your head. You don't have to respect my choices, but you will respect my effort." He turned away, muttering, "Yes, whatever helps you sleep." When the door slammed behind him, I felt something deep inside me splinter. The weight of 2 worlds pressing harder, the world of what I'd lost, and the one that still wouldn't let me belong. I went to bed exhausted, heart heavy but oddly awake. Somewhere in that grand house, a man who'd lost everything saw in me something worth remembering. And somewhere under my own roof, my son saw nothing but shame. I didn't know which truth hurt more. But I did know this: something was changing. The walls around me, both marble and emotional, were starting to crack. And when walls crack, the light always finds a way. There's a kind of quiet that lives between storms, that still, heavy silence before everything changes. That's what the mansion felt like that week, perfect on the surface, trembling underneath. Spring had come early, bringing warm winds and restless hearts. The magnolias in the coal garden had started to bloom, large, white, flawless. I was trimming them one afternoon when Veronica's voice sliced through the calm. "Mrs. Hayes," she called from the balcony above. "Father needs you in the study. Now." I wiped my hands on my apron and went inside. The study smelled of cedar and arguments. Richard was standing by the window, papers scattered across his desk. Veronica sat opposite him, arms folded, looking every inch the executive she wanted the world to believe she was. When Richard saw me, he sighed. "I'm sorry, Monica. I didn't mean for you to get dragged into this." Veronica turned, her eyes sharp. "Dragged. She's involved in everything that happens in this house now, isn't she?" "I asked her opinion on the staff budget," Richard said evenly. "She's been running things more efficiently than anyone else." Veronica laughed, a sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course she has. People from her background are used to stretching every penny." Her words stung, but I didn't let them show. I just straightened my back and said, "Efficiency isn't about background, MS, Cole, it's about care." Richard smiled faintly, like he wanted to applaud but knew better. "That's exactly why I value her insight." Veronica stood, brushing invisible dust from her designer skirt. "Well, forgive me if I don't find comfort in a stranger managing our family's estate." "Then maybe you should try managing it yourself," Richard said quietly. Her face hardened, but she said nothing more. She left the room, her heels clicking down the hall like punctuation marks of anger. When she was gone, Richard rubbed his temples. "I'm sorry, she's not a bad person, just protective." "Protective of what?" I asked gently. He hesitated. "Of what's left. This company, this house, it's all she has of her mother, and maybe she thinks you're taking it." "I'm not taking anything, Mr. Cole," I said softly. "I'm just keeping it clean." He looked up at me, eyes tired but grateful. "Sometimes cleaning up is the hardest job in the world." That night, I came home to find Devin sitting at the kitchen table again, a laptop open, his face lit by blue light and bad decisions. "Mom," he said, not looking up, "I need a favor." "Devin, last time you said that it cost me 3 months of savings. This is different." He turned the screen toward me, a website full of charts, numbers, promises. "It's an investment opportunity, a startup that's about to explode. I've got connections, Mom. I just need a small loan to buy in early." "How small?" I asked. 10,000. I laughed before I could stop myself. "Devin, we don't have 10,000. I barely have 10. He frowned. "I know you're working for that Cole guy. Don't act like you're broke." "Don't talk about him like that." "Why not? He's rich. You think he's helping you out of kindness? Please, people like that don't help people like us unless they are bored." I slammed my hand on the table, surprising even myself. "You will not disrespect me or him. I'm doing everything I can to keep this family together while you sit here gambling on fantasies." He pushed back his chair. "You think scrubbing floors for a millionaire makes you noble? It makes you useful, Mom. To them, you'll always be useful, never equal." His words hit harder than I wanted them to. When he left, the door shut with that same familiar finality I'd heard since Calvin died, the sound of men walking away when love stopped being convenient. At work, the tension was no better. Veronica had started showing up unannounced, inspecting every corner like a detective looking for dirt. The staff grew nervous. Even Mrs. Dillard, who had once ignored me, now whispered warnings. "She's looking for reasons to get rid of you," she said one morning while polishing the silver. "Be careful, Mrs. Hayes. The last woman Mr. Cole hired didn't last a month." "Why?" Mrs. Dillard shrugged. She smiled too much. "That's all it takes sometimes." One rainy Thursday, I found Richard in the dining hall pacing. The long mahogany table gleamed, every glass aligned like soldiers. He stopped when he saw me. "Monica, I need you to sit." I hesitated. "Is everything all right?" He handed me an envelope. Inside were documents, contracts, company reports, and a letter. The words blurred together, but one name stood out: Veronica Cole. She's been moving company funds into personal accounts, he said quietly. Small amounts, but steady. I wouldn't have noticed if the auditors hadn't flagged it. My heart sank. Does she know you know? Not yet, but she'll find out soon enough. He sighed. I built this empire for my family, but I never taught my daughter how to live without power. Maybe that's my fault. What will you do? He looked at me not as an employer, but as someone looking for strength in another person's eyes. What would you do, Monica? I thought for a moment. If it were my child, I'd want to protect them, but I wouldn't lie for them. Love doesn't mean hiding truth. He nodded slowly, almost painfully. That's what Evelyn would have said. The room fell silent except for the rain tapping against the tall windows. Later that evening, while clearing the dining table, I found something strange. A small silver bracelet beneath one of the chairs. Elegant, expensive, not mine. When I brought it to Mrs. Dillard, she shook her head. Not one of ours, but I've seen MS. Veronica wear something similar. I turned the bracelet in my hand and noticed an engraving inside, R.C. All my love, E. Richard Cole. Evelyn, a gift from his late wife. My stomach turned. What was it doing under the table? The next day, the answer came like a slap. At lunch, Veronica entered the dining room, face pale, voice trembling with rage. Someone's stolen from me, she announced to the staff. My mother's bracelet is missing. I froze. She turned to me. You were the last one in here last night, weren't you? I was, I said evenly, but I found the bracelet under the table and gave it to Mrs. Dillard. Mrs. Dillard opened her mouth, then hesitated, fear flickering across her face. I didn't see any bracelet. I felt the blood drain from my cheeks. That's not true. You. Enough, Veronica snapped. Father will hear about this. When she stormed out, the other staff avoided my gaze. I stood there, heart pounding, realizing how easy it is for truth to drown when money decides who speaks. By the time I got home, I was shaking. Devin wasn't there. Kayla sat on the couch, her textbooks open but unread. She looked up, eyes red. Mom, she whispered, we need to talk. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. She took a deep breath. I didn't want to tell you until I was sure. I'm pregnant. The room tilted. What? She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I'm sorry. I didn't plan it. His name's Aaron. He said he loved me, and then he stopped answering my calls. I sat down beside her, my heart breaking in two directions, one for her, one for the life she was about to carry. Kayla, I whispered, pulling her into my arms, we'll figure this out. I promise you we'll find a way. She sobbed into my shoulder. You're not mad? Mad, I said softly. Honey, I've been tired, broke, humiliated, but never mad at you for needing love. Outside, thunder rolled, low, distant, inevitable. That night, I sat by the window long after Kayla had fallen asleep. The rain beat against the glass like fists. Somewhere across town, Veronica was plotting, and at home, my children were slipping away from me in different ways. I thought about Richard, about trust and truth and how fragile both could be. And for the first time since Calvin's death, I wondered if I'd made a mistake stepping into that mansion. Because sometimes the walls don't keep danger out. Sometimes they keep you in, with secrets waiting under the table. There are nights that change everything, and you don't realize it until the morning after, when the air itself feels heavier, as if the world forgot to exhale. That night began like any other. Dinner dishes drying in the rack, the faint buzz of the refrigerator, Kayla studying on the couch, and my heart still caught somewhere between fear and fatigue. But somewhere else, in a mansion far too quiet for its size, my name was being spoken, and not kindly. It started around 7. The phone rang. Richard's voice was on the other end, calm but heavy. Monica, could you come by the house? It's important. Something in his tone told me important didn't mean urgent, it meant trouble. I drove through the rain, headlights carving through fog, praying it was just another misunderstanding. By the time I reached the Cole estate, the sky was bruised purple and the driveway glistened like spilled ink. Veronica's car was already there. So were two others I didn't recognize. When I stepped inside, the staff avoided my eyes. Mrs. Dillard kept her head down. I could smell tension, that cold, metallic scent that always comes before a storm breaks. Richard was waiting in the study. He wasn't alone. Veronica stood beside him, arms crossed, face unreadable. "Monica," he began carefully, "we've had a situation." Veronica cut in. "A theft." My stomach tightened. "You can't be serious." She held up a small velvet pouch, the one I'd seen in her mother's portrait case. "This was found in your car." I blinked. "What?" Richard's eyes searched mine. "Is it true?" "No," I said, stepping forward. "I never," but Veronica was ready. "Mrs. Dillard saw you leaving late the night it went missing. The gate guard confirmed your car exited after midnight. That's because you fired me, remember?" I said, voice shaking. "I was gathering my things. I told you I'd forgotten my keys." She smiled, the kind of smile that feeds on someone else's ruin. "Convenient." I turned to Richard, desperate. "You know me, you know I wouldn't steal from you." He didn't speak. He just looked down at the floor, then back at me. "I want to believe that," he said quietly, "but until I sort this out, I think it's best you take some time away." "Take some time away," Veronica repeated, her tone sugar over venom. "That's generous." The silence that followed was worse than any accusation. It told me everything, that truth doesn't matter when money does, that even kindness has limits when weighed against family. I walked out of that mansion with my dignity barely intact, the rain cold against my face, the taste of betrayal bitter on my tongue. When I got home, Devin was waiting, pacing, wild-eyed. "Where were you?" he demanded. "I needed you." "Devin, not now." He slammed his hand on the table. "I told you about the investment. The deadline's tonight. I just need $5,000, that's all." "I don't have it," I shouted. "I just lost my job." He stared at me, disbelief twisting into anger. "What did you do this time, Mom?" I felt the words like a slap. "This time?" He laughed bitterly. "It's always something, isn't it? Dad dies, bills pile up, and somehow it's never your fault." "You think I wanted this life?" I snapped. "You think I enjoy scraping together pennies so you can play businessman?" He stepped closer, his face inches from mine. "I think you're just like him, pretending you're holding everything together while it all falls apart." Something inside me broke. Not loud, just broke. "Get out," I whispered. "What?" "Get out, Devin. Until you can talk to me like a son, not a stranger, get out of my house." He hesitated, jaw tight, then grabbed his coat. "Fine. Maybe I'll go find someone who actually believes in me." When the door slammed, the silence felt alive, sharp, echoing, cruel. Kayla appeared in the hallway, her face pale. "Mom," I turned toward her, my strength finally running out. "Go back to bed, baby." She didn't move. He didn't mean it. "I know," I said, voice trembling. "But words don't need to mean something to hurt." She walked over, hugged me tight. For a moment, the world stopped shaking. The next morning, I woke to a knock on the door. A man in a suit stood outside, tall, polite, holding an envelope. "Mrs. Hayes?" "Yes. I'm with Cole Industries. Mr. Cole asked me to deliver this." Inside the envelope was a check, 3 months' wages, and a letter written in Richard's careful handwriting. "Monica, I'm sorry for the confusion. I need time to sort through this matter. Please take care of yourself and your family." R.C. No apology for doubt. No truth. Just distance, wrapped in politeness. I sat at the table staring at the paper, wondering how everything could unravel so fast, how you could be innocent and still look guilty if the wrong person tells your story louder. Kayla came in, rubbing her eyes. "Was that from him?" "Yes. Are you going back?" I looked at the check. "No," I said quietly. "Not like this." For the next few days, the house was a blur of broken routines. Devin didn't call. Kayla grew quieter. Bills stacked up again, like old ghosts returning to familiar haunts. I tried to find work elsewhere, the diner, the office building, even the hospital where I once cleaned years ago. But every "we'll call you" felt like another closed door. Then came the letter. An official one, embossed seal, formal tone. It was from Coal Industries' legal department. An internal investigation regarding the missing property remains ongoing. Until resolved, you are prohibited from entering company premises or contacting employees. I crumpled the letter before I finished reading. It wasn't just my job they'd taken, it was my reputation. That night, I sat in the dark living room, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. Kayla was asleep. The clock ticked louder than usual. I thought about calling Richard, but what would I say? Please believe me. I'd already said that once. Once should have been enough. The rain started again, tapping the windows like it was trying to remind me I was still here, still breathing. And then the phone rang. It was Mrs. Dillard, her voice shook. Monica, I shouldn't be calling, but you need to know it wasn't you. Veronica planted the bracelet. She's been covering up transfers from the foundation account. Mr. Cole's finding out now. My breath caught. Does he know? He will soon. But be careful, Mrs. Hayes. She's angry. You embarrassed her. Before I could ask more, the line went dead. An hour later, another call came, this time from Richard. His voice was raw, almost unrecognizable. Monica, please, I'm so sorry. Veronica confessed. She used you to hide her mistake. I should have trusted you. I didn't answer. The apology landed somewhere deep but couldn't find footing. Please, he continued. Come back tomorrow. We'll fix this. I looked around at the little house that had known too much struggle and too little peace. At Kayla, asleep on the couch, her hand resting over her belly. And for the first time, I realized something. I didn't want to go back. Not to that mansion, not to that power, not to any place where I had to prove my worth to be seen. I can't, I said softly. Not anymore. Monica, take care of yourself, Richard, and tell your daughter she doesn't need to fear me. I was never her enemy. I hung up before he could reply. When I went to bed, sleep didn't come. My mind replayed everything, the lies, the losses, the loneliness. But underneath it all, something new stirred, not anger this time, not grief, clarity. I'd spent my life surviving storms, waiting for someone to pull me out of the rain, but maybe I was never meant to be rescued. Maybe I was meant to learn how to build my own roof. By morning, the sky was clear. Devin was still gone, but Kayla was up early making tea. She looked at me and smiled weakly. You look different, Mom. I feel different, I said. And I did, because when everything breaks, what's left isn't weakness, it's the truth of who you are. That day, I opened my laptop, created a new folder, and typed 2 words at the top of a blank document. Project New Life. I didn't know what it would become. Not yet. But I knew one thing, the woman who'd walked out of that mansion was gone. The one sitting here was just beginning. 3 days passed before the letter came. I found it wedged between bills and a grocery coupon, the envelope heavier than the rest, cream paper, gold trim, my name written in a careful, almost hesitant hand. I stood there by the mailbox for a long moment, just holding it. The neighborhood was quiet, the afternoon sun soft and ordinary. Funny how life never looks different, even when yours is about to change again. When I finally opened it, I recognized the handwriting immediately. Richard Cole, Monica, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but please read this. I owe you more than an apology. You were right, truth doesn't need defending when it's real, but people like me forget that. I believed my daughter because I was afraid of losing her. I lost you instead. Evelyn used to say integrity is the only wealth that can't be stolen. You reminded me of that, and now I want to make something right, not for me, for you. If you can, meet me at the garden. 6 o'clock. No explanations required. Just come. R.C. I read it twice. Then a third time, something about the words, the humility, the careful phrasing felt different from the man who had once doubted me. Still, I hesitated. Pride told me to tear the letter apart. But curiosity whispered, what if this isn't another ending? What if it's a beginning? At 5:30, I found myself changing into my best blouse. The blue one Kayla said made me look important. She watched me from the couch, her small belly showing now, her eyes both protective and proud. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" she asked. I nodded. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about them. It's about peace for us. The sun was dipping low when I reached Evelyn's garden, the same place Richard had once shown me, all soft light and roses that looked too delicate for real life. He was waiting near the fountain, his hands clasped, his expression uncertain. There were deep lines around his eyes now, the kind that come from regret, not age. "Monica," he said, his voice low, "thank you for coming. I almost didn't. I wouldn't have blamed you." We stood there for a while, the silence between us surprisingly gentle. "I heard about what happened with your son," he said carefully. "I'm sorry. Losing your footing in family feels worse than any scandal." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He reached into his coat pocket and handed me another envelope. This one was thick, official looking. I didn't open it right away. "What is this?" "A job offer," he said. "And before you say no, it's not charity, it's a partnership." I frowned. "Partnership?" "I've started a foundation," he explained. "In Evelyn's name, the Evelyn Cole Trust. It was supposed to fund scholarships and community programs, but honestly, it's been neglected. I can't run it myself, and I don't trust the people who do." He took a breath. "You've managed people, homes, chaos. You've built stability from nothing. That's leadership, Monica. You just never had the title." I blinked. "You want me to run your foundation?" "I want you to lead it," he corrected softly. "Give it purpose again. Give me a reason to believe in something that isn't profit margins and family politics." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words hung in the air, impossible, like a dream that had accidentally crossed into daylight. "Why me?" I finally whispered. He smiled, just barely. "Because you know what loss looks like and you still choose kindness. That's rare. And because Evelyn would have liked you, I think she's somewhere rooting for this." We sat on a stone bench near the fountain. The sound of water was soft, steady, almost like breathing. I turned the envelope over in my hands, the paper thick beneath my fingers. "I don't know, Richard. I don't have a degree. I've never managed a foundation. I wouldn't even know where to start." "That's the beauty of it," he said. "You'll learn. You've already proven you can. I've arranged for training, a team, whatever you need. But the heart of it, that has to come from you." "Why not Veronica?" I asked quietly. He sighed. "She's handling her own reckoning. We've spoken. She's angry, but I think she's finally realizing the cost of her pride. I've given her space, but this foundation, it's not her path. It's yours." He looked at me then, really looked. Not as an employer, not as a man trying to make amends, but as someone seeing another person's worth fully for the first time. "Monica," he said, "you spent your whole life serving others. It's time you start leading." That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the offer letter open beside my cup of tea. Kayla had fallen asleep on the couch again, her head resting on a baby name book. The house was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the faint creak of the ceiling fan. I stared at the contract. The salary was more than I'd ever imagined earning. The position title read, Director of Community Operations, the Evelyn Cole Foundation. For a long time, I just watched the words, afraid that if I blinked, they might disappear. Then I heard Calvin's voice in my head, the one I'd buried with him years ago, his laugh, that mix of pride and teasing. "You always sell yourself short, Monica. One day someone's gonna see what I see." I picked up the pen from the counter. My hand shook as I signed, not from fear, but from the realization that this moment was what survival had been preparing me for. The next morning, I called Pastor Elijah. He'd been our neighbor since before Devin was born, a man of faith, though I'd stopped visiting his church long ago. "Pastor," I said, "I think I'm being given something big. I just don't know if I'm ready." He chuckled softly. "God doesn't hand out easy assignments, child. He hands out meaningful ones." I'm scared, I admitted. Good, he said, that means it matters. When I arrived at the Foundation's downtown office a week later, a small sign by the glass door read, "The Evelyn Cole Trust Building Hope from Loss." Inside, sunlight poured across the polished floors. The air smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Richard was there waiting, a quiet pride in his eyes. "Welcome home," he said. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that phrase, home. No marble halls, no silk curtains, just purpose, the kind that fits where faith and work meet. "All right," I said, setting my bag down. "Let's get to work." He smiled, spoken like a director. That evening, as I walked out into the city dusk, I called Kayla. "How'd it go, Mom?" I said, smiling into the twilight, "it's the first day of the rest of our lives." And as the sun dipped behind the skyline, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not luck, not even joy. It was peace. The quiet kind that doesn't come from having everything, but from finally knowing who you are. There's a certain silence that follows redemption. Not the quiet of defeat, but the calm that comes after you've survived your own storm and realized, somehow, you're still standing. The first morning at the Foundation, I sat behind a desk that wasn't mine yet, staring at a blank calendar and an empty inbox. Outside the window, downtown Atlanta buzzed, car horns, construction, laughter, the rhythm of ordinary life. Inside, I felt like an imposter sitting in someone else's story. The office was small but full of potential. Pale walls, new furniture, a vase of lilies Richard had sent over with a note that read, "Every great story starts with one act of faith." I thought about that line as I looked around. Everything here was spotless, except for me. I wasn't spotless. I was scarred, cracked, patched together with equal parts exhaustion and hope. But maybe that's exactly why I was here. Maybe this place didn't need perfection. It needed someone who'd already fallen apart and learned how to rebuild. The first few weeks were chaos disguised as progress. I hired 2 assistants, both single mothers who'd been out of work for months. Tasha, who'd survived an abusive marriage, and Lee, who'd lost her home after a medical bill wiped out her savings. They reminded me of myself in different chapters. The woman who'd learned to smile through exhaustion, who'd stretched every dollar until it screamed. We worked long hours, drinking too much coffee and laughing too loud. Every application we approved meant one more family would get a second chance, a scholarship for a daughter, a housing grant for a mother, a microloan for a woman who dared to start again. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was sacred in its own way. Every story that crossed my desk felt like a mirror, each one reflecting a version of me I thought I'd buried. By the 3rd month, the Evelyn Cole Trust had funded over 30 programs, literacy workshops, daycare partnerships, job training for widows. The newspapers called it a quiet revolution led by an unexpected voice. When I saw my name in print, I didn't feel pride. I felt purpose. One afternoon, I was reviewing grant applications when Richard knocked gently on the doorframe. He looked healthier, or maybe just lighter. The weight of guilt had softened in him, replaced by something steadier. "You've turned this place around," he said. "Even the board's impressed." I smiled. "It's not me. It's the people who believe in second chances." He chuckled. "You sound like Evelyn. She believed in community. She believed in grace," he said, his voice quiet. "And in people like you." There was a pause, the kind that hums between understanding and emotion. "I wish she'd met you," he added. I looked down at my papers, unsure what to say. "Maybe she did," I finally whispered. "Sometimes the people we've lost find their way back through the work we do." He nodded slowly, his eyes warm with something that felt almost like peace. That night, I drove home under a sky streaked with orange and violet. The streetlights flickered on one by one, as if the city itself was applauding the day's quiet victories. Kayla was waiting on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her belly round and luminous in the dusk. "How was work, Mom?" she asked. Busy, I said, sinking beside her. Good busy. She smiled. You're different lately. Stronger. I laughed softly. You think so? I know so. You walk like someone who finally stopped apologizing for surviving. Her words stayed with me long after she'd gone inside, because she was right. For years, I'd lived as though my pain required permission. Now, I was learning that strength doesn't always roar, sometimes it just keeps showing up. A few days later, I received a call from Pastor Elijah. Monica, he said, there's a woman at the church who could use your help. Her husband passed last year and she's drowning in debt. I thought of you. I hesitated. The story felt too familiar, too close, but I went anyway. Her name was Angela Brooks, 49, 2 sons, and the same hollow look I'd once carried like a scar. We sat together in the church basement, surrounded by folding chairs and the faint smell of wax polish. I don't know where to start, she confessed, voice trembling. He left me with nothing but bills and a house I can't afford. I reached across the table, taking her hand. Start with breathing, then we'll build from there. For the next hour, we went through her papers. I showed her how to budget, how to contact the right programs, how to ask for help without shame. When she cried, I handed her tissues and said, "It's okay to fall apart as long as you keep reaching for the pieces." By the time we finished, her shoulders had relaxed a little. Hope, fragile, flickering, had returned to her eyes. Driving home that night, I realized something simple but profound. I wasn't just rebuilding my life anymore. I was helping others rebuild theirs. That weekend, Richard hosted a small event at the foundation, a fundraiser honoring Evelyn's legacy. I wore the same blue blouse, the one Kayla called my power color. When I walked in, I heard murmurs ripple through the crowd, people recognizing the woman who'd once been accused of theft, now leading one of the city's most talked-about initiatives. Richard took the stage first, his speech measured but heartfelt. When my wife died, he said, I thought the best of our family had gone with her. But then someone walked into my life and reminded me what resilience looks like. Monica Hayes didn't just revive this foundation, she revived its soul. Applause filled the room. I felt my throat tighten as he motioned for me to join him on stage. Standing beside him under the soft glow of chandeliers, I looked out at the faces before me, donors, employees, strangers, and I thought of Calvin, of Devon, of every woman who's ever had to start over with trembling hands. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't prepare notes. I just spoke from the truth that had carried me this far. Loss doesn't end you, I began. It introduces you to the part of yourself that knows how to survive. I've learned that rebuilding isn't about restoring what was broken, it's about creating something better with what's left. Silence followed. Then applause, slow at first, then rising like a tide. I caught Richard's eye. He smiled, proud but quiet, the way you look at someone who's found their own wings. That night, as I drove home, the air felt softer somehow, less heavy. When I pulled into the driveway, Kayla was waiting, holding a framed sonogram photo. It's a girl, she whispered. I felt tears sting my eyes. A girl? She nodded. I want to name her Evelyn. I couldn't speak for a long moment. The night around us seemed to hold its breath. Then I pulled her into my arms and whispered, she's going to change everything. Kayla smiled. Like you did. Later, as I sat by the window, moonlight spilling across my kitchen table, I thought about the last few years, the losses, the betrayals, the nights I thought I'd never make it to morning. And now, here I was, a woman with a purpose, a daughter with new life, and a future that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. The ruins of my old life had become the foundation of something unshakable. Sometimes, grace doesn't come as light from the sky. Sometimes, it comes as work, steady, quiet, and holy in its repetition. And for the first time in years, I was no longer surviving. I was building. It's strange how life has a way of circling back, how the people we lose find their way to our doorstep again, not as who they were, but as the consequences of everything they've done. It had been 5 months since Devin left, 5 months since the door slammed and silence took his place. At first, I told myself he'd call. Then I told myself I didn't care if he didn't. Both were lies, of course. A mother never stops caring. She just learns to stop begging. Kayla was 8 months along by then. Her laughter filled the house again, a small miracle I didn't take for granted. She'd paint tiny clouds on the nursery wall, hum to her belly, and ask me every night, "Do you think he'll come back, Mom?" I never answered. Not because I didn't have hope, but because I'd finally learned that hope, when it comes to men we love, should be earned. Then one night, as rain whispered against the windows, always the rain, like it was fate's signature, there came a knock on the door. When I opened it, I almost didn't recognize him. Devin stood there soaked through, thinner, older. His eyes carried that same desperate pride his father once wore before every bad decision. "Hey, Mom," he said softly. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. "You always could." He walked in like someone entering a church, quiet, humbled, carrying invisible sins. The house smelled of chamomile and baby lotion. He looked around, eyes landing on the nursery door left slightly open. "She's really doing it, huh?" he said. "She is." He smiled faintly. "I missed a lot." "You did." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd once shouted, where dreams had cracked under the weight of survival. He rubbed his hands together. "I messed up, Mom. I said nothing. Let the truth have space to breathe." "I got into the wrong crowd," he continued. "Guys I thought were friends. We were trying to flip cars, make fast cash. One thing led to another: loans, lies, stupid choices, and now," he trailed off. "And now what, Devin? Now I owe people," he whispered. "A lot of people." I felt my chest tighten. "How much?" 30,000. The number hit me like a cold slap. "Devin, how?" "I was trying to fix things," he said quickly. "I thought if I made enough, I could pay off the mortgage, help Kayla, help you. I swear I didn't mean for it to go this far." I looked at him, really looked, and saw not the reckless boy, but the scared child who used to hold my hand crossing the street. He was still that boy, just buried under bad decisions. And I was still his mother, whether I liked it or not. For days after that, I couldn't think straight. The foundation was thriving, donors calling, meetings scheduled, a gala on the horizon. But every time I tried to focus, I'd see Devin's face, ashamed, exhausted, still my son. I thought about telling Richard. He'd help, I knew he would, but I also knew that accepting help again might undo everything I'd rebuilt. I'd spent years earning back my dignity. I wasn't about to trade it for another favor. That night, I sat with my notebook and calculator, going through every penny I had. Savings, not enough. Foundation's salary, already spoken for. I could sell the car, walk to work if I had to. But even then, it wouldn't cover half. I pressed my palms to my eyes, whispering, "Lord, give me wisdom." Because sometimes faith isn't about believing in miracles, it's about believing you'll survive without one. The next morning, Devin offered to come with me to the foundation. "I want to see where you work," he said, "where you rebuilt." I hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but you behave." He grinned. "You say that like I'm still 12. Sometimes you are." When we walked into the office, Tasha and Lee greeted us with smiles. "Is this your son?" Lee asked. I nodded, trying to sound casual. "The prodigal returns." Devin blushed. "Nice to meet you." As he looked around the office, the framed photos, the mural of women we'd helped, I saw something shift in him, awe maybe, or regret. "This place," he said quietly, "it feels different." "It's built on stories," I told him. "Every brick, every desk, every check we sign comes from someone who refused to stay broken." He nodded slowly. "Maybe I can help somehow." "Help?" I laughed softly. "Devin, you can barely help yourself." "I know," he said, "but maybe that's why I should try." And for the first time, I didn't see a boy lost to guilt. I saw a man trying to find his way home. But life has a cruel habit of testing redemption before it allows it. A week later, a dark sedan parked outside our house. Two men stepped out, suits too sharp for comfort, smiles too polite to be friendly. "Mrs. Hayes?" one of them asked. "Yes, we're looking for your son, Devin Hayes." Devin appeared behind me, pale. "It's fine, Mom," he said quickly. "I'll handle it." The men exchanged a look. "We'll be in touch," one said. "Tell your boy to keep his word." Then they left. When the car pulled away, I turned to him. "Devin, what did you do?" He sat on the porch steps, face in his hands. "I thought I could buy time. I promised them I'd pay by next month, but I don't have it, and they don't take promises as currency." My heart ached not for the debt, but for how small he looked again, how familiar his desperation was, because I'd been there once too, trapped between pride and survival. "Devin," I said gently, sitting beside him, "we can't fix this the same way we broke it. No more hiding, no more lies." He looked up at me, eyes red. "Then what do we do?" "We rebuild," I said softly. "The same way I did, but this time you start with honesty." The next morning, I called Richard. He answered on the first ring. "Monica, I need advice," I said. "Anything." I hesitated. "It's about my son." There was silence, then a calm exhale. "Tell me everything." When I finished, he said quietly, 30,000 can be repaid. Integrity cannot. You've already taught him the first lesson, now let me help with the second." "Richard, I can't take your money." "It's not money," he said. "It's opportunity. Let him work it off. The foundation could use hands for the new community center. Let him earn back what he owes to them and to himself." I felt tears welling. "You do that for him?" "For you," he said, "and for every mother who refuses to give up on her son." When I told Devin, he stared at me like I was speaking another language. "You'd still trust me around your work?" "I don't trust you yet," I said honestly. "But I believe in the man you can still become." He swallowed hard, then nodded. "I'll make this right, Mom, I swear." And for the first time since Calvin's funeral, I saw something in my son's eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Not arrogance, not anger, but hope. That night, I stood by the nursery window, watching the streetlights flicker over our quiet block. Kayla was asleep, one hand on her belly, peace on her face. Devin was upstairs, already setting an early alarm for his first day at the foundation. And me. I felt both fear and faith, tangled together like roots and soil, inseparable, necessary. Because rebuilding a life isn't a single act. It's a daily decision to forgive, to trust, to keep the light on for the people you love, even when they've been gone too long. Outside, the rain began again, steady, gentle, familiar. I smiled, whispering to the dark. "Let it pour. We've weathered worse." They say healing isn't a straight line. It's a circle, one that keeps bringing you back to the same lessons until you learn them. And that winter, the lesson came wrapped in smoke, fear, and a single, merciful sunrise. Devin had been working at the foundation for 6 weeks. To everyone's surprise, even his own, he was good at it. He fixed what was broken, lifted what was heavy, and more importantly, he showed up on time. For the first time in years, I saw the boy I'd raised, the one who used to help me hand out food at church drives, the one who believed that kindness was currency. Richard had taken a liking to him too. "He's sharp," he told me one morning. "He learns fast. You raised him well, Monica." I smiled, though part of me couldn't help whispering, not well enough. At home, Kayla was days away from giving birth. The nursery was ready, soft pinks, white lace curtains, a hand-me-down crib I'd sanded and painted myself. Every night I'd sit beside her, rubbing her shoulders as she talked to her unborn daughter like she was already in the room. "I'm naming her Evelyn Grace," she said one evening, eyes glowing. "After Grandma Evelyn and for Grace, because somehow we keep getting it." Then came the night everything almost ended. It started with a phone call. Richard's voice was tight, strained. "Monica, are you at home?" "Yes, why?" "There's been a break-in at the community center." Devin was closing up. He called security, but I didn't hear the rest. I was already out the door, keys shaking in my hand. The drive across town blurred, rain on the windshield, red lights, fear humming in my chest like static. When I arrived, the flashing blue and red lights painted the building like a nightmare. Smoke was pouring from the back windows. I ran toward the crowd, shouting, "Where's my son?" A firefighter grabbed my arm. "Ma'am, you can't. That's my son in there," I screamed. Before he could stop me, another voice called out, "Over here." Two paramedics were guiding someone out through the side door, coughing, soot-streaked, limping. It was Devin. I ran to him, dropped to my knees on the wet pavement, clutching his face in my hands. His skin was warm and ashy, eyes wide and wet. "Mom," he rasped, "I tried to stop them. They wanted the donation cash, 30 grand for the center's reopening. I told them it wasn't here, but they didn't believe me. They started a fire. I could barely breathe. You could have died." He gave a weak laugh. "Guess I still owe you a few miracles." The paramedics pulled him gently away to check his lungs. I just sat there, trembling, watching the flames swallow months of work, and with it, the illusion that our pain had finally ended. The next morning, the fire made the news. Community center blaze, arson suspected, funds missing. They said 2 men were seen fleeing the scene, the same men who'd visited our house weeks earlier. When I arrived at the hospital, Devin was sitting up, bandaged but alive. His first words were, "I didn't take it, Mom, I swear." "I know," I said. "This time I believe you before the evidence." Tears filled his eyes. "They think I stole it again. The cops, the reporters, everyone. Then we'll prove them wrong." I turned to find Richard standing in the doorway, a folder in his hand. "They won't need proof," he said quietly. "The cameras caught everything. Devin fought them off before the fire spread. He saved the foundation's records and half the equipment." I looked from him to my son, speechless. Richard continued, "The mayor called this morning. They're naming him in the papers, the young man who risked his life for his community." Devin's mouth fell open. "You're serious?" Richard smiled. "Dead serious." Later that afternoon, as I sat by Devin's bed, I realized I wasn't shaking anymore. For years, fear had been my shadow. But watching my son bruised, bandaged, and breathing, I felt something else rise inside me. Pride, the kind that isn't loud or showy, just quiet, steady, and earned. "You saved something bigger than a building," I told him. He frowned. "What do you mean? You saved yourself." He leaned back, eyes closing, a small smile ghosting across his face. "Maybe you're right, Mom. I usually am," I said, and he laughed, hoarse but genuine. That night when I got home, Kayla was sitting on the couch, hand on her belly, a calm smile on her face. "I saw the news," she said. "He's a hero." "He's alive," I whispered. "That's enough." Then right there, her expression shifted. "Mom," she gasped, clutching her stomach, "it's time." I froze for half a heartbeat, then sprang into motion. We grabbed her bag, the car keys, the baby blanket. By the time we reached the hospital, she was already in labor. Hours later, between pain and tears and prayer, a cry filled the room. Strong, demanding, alive. When the nurse placed the baby in my arms, I saw everything: Calvin's smile, Kayla's eyes, and a hint of my mother's spirit in that tiny, wrinkled face. "She's perfect," Kayla whispered. "She's ours," I said, and for the first time in years, the word ours didn't feel heavy. We named her Evelyn Grace. And just like her namesake, she arrived in the middle of a storm, carrying peace in her lungs. A week later, the city honored Devin at the rebuilt community center. Richard gave the speech, but when it was my turn to speak, my voice shook. "I used to think strength was about never falling," I said. "But I've learned that real strength is in the getting back up, in rebuilding the life that burned down around you." My son fell, but he rose. My daughter lost, but she gave life. And me, I learned that sometimes fire doesn't destroy, it refines. When the applause came, it sounded like forgiveness. That evening, after everyone had gone, I walked through the new center, fresh paint, new glass, brighter lights. Devin stood beside me, holding baby Evelyn, who was fast asleep in his arms. "She's light," he said softly. "She's Hope," I answered. Richard joined us, hands in his pockets, eyes warm. "You know, Monica, this building might be named after Evelyn Cole, but I think her spirit lives in you." I smiled. She and I both know what it's like to lose everything and still start again. He nodded. "Then let's keep starting." That night, at home, I sat by the window once more where everything had begun. The rain came, as it always did, but this time I didn't flinch. I let it fall, grateful for the sound, for the cleansing, for the reminder that storms don't last, people do. In the other room, I could hear Kayla humming to Evelyn. Devon's laughter followed, light, unburdened. And for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel like a memory. It felt like a miracle, because sometimes life takes everything from you, so it can give it back one piece at a time, stronger than before, forged in fire, rebuilt from ruins. And I, Monica Hayes, was no longer the widow waiting for the world to love her again. I was the woman who learned to love her own life first. Morning came with quiet colors, pale gold, gentle blue, the kind of sky that looks like forgiveness. For the first time in years, I woke without panic in my chest. No overdue bills, no unanswered calls, no ghosts waiting by the door. Just sunlight spilling across the crib beside my bed, and the soft breath of Evelyn Grace, sleeping like peace itself. Kayla was still asleep on the couch, hair messy, one arm draped over a pile of baby blankets. Devon was in the kitchen, humming to himself, making pancakes that looked more like burnt promises, but he was trying. That was all that mattered. The smell of coffee filled the house. Ordinary, beautiful. It had been 1 year since the fire. 1 year since the night we thought everything would crumble again. But we'd survived, not by magic, not by wealth, but by love that refused to quit. At the Evelyn Cole Foundation, our small team had grown into something remarkable. The new community center was open and alive every day. Kids laughing in after-school programs, mothers attending job workshops, fathers learning to cook for the first time. The walls smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Sometimes I'd walk through the hallways during lunch, coffee in hand, listening to the hum of new beginnings. And I'd whisper, "We did it, Calvin. We finally did it." Richard had stepped back from daily operations, but he still came by every Friday with pastries and stories. He'd become more than a benefactor. He was family now, the kind of friend who reminded me that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. One afternoon, as we reviewed next year's budget, he said quietly, "You know, Monica, I used to think legacy meant money, buildings, names on plaques, but now I see it's something else." "What's that?" I asked. "Legacy is when someone like you walks into a broken place and leaves it standing." I smiled. Then maybe we both found our legacy. At home, life was simpler. Kayla was studying again, taking online classes in early childhood education. She wanted to teach one day. Devon, now a full-time coordinator at the foundation, had earned back not just trust, but pride. He rode the bus every morning with a smile that no longer carried shame. And little Evelyn, she was growing fast. When she laughed, it sounded like light. When she grabbed my finger, I swore I could feel the pulse of every generation that had loved before her. One Sunday, as we all sat in the backyard, Devon grilling, Kayla feeding the baby, Richard joining us with lemonade, I realized that this was what rebuilding looked like. Not perfection, not wealth, just peace, just presence. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, I found myself sitting on the porch alone, holding my cup of tea. The cicadas hummed in the distance, and a soft breeze brushed through the magnolia trees, the same kind that had once lined the Cole mansion, now planted here in my own yard, blooming under new ownership. I thought about everything that had led me here. The hospital room, the funeral, the betrayal, the fire. Each heartbreak had carved a space inside me, and somehow that space had made room for more light. Grief hadn't left me, it never does, but it had learned to sit quietly beside gratitude. We shared the same table now. And that, I realized, was healing. The next morning, the city paper ran a story titled, "From Widow to Founder, the Woman Who Rebuilt Hope." I stared at my photo, me, smiling awkwardly beside the new community garden. For a moment, I laughed. "Lord," I whispered, "if only they knew the real story." Because this wasn't about one woman's triumph. It was about everyone who kept her standing, the daughter who believed again, the son who came home, the friend who chose forgiveness over pride, and the strangers who turned kindness into action. A few weeks later, the foundation held its first Women of Resilience event. Hundreds of women filled the auditorium, some laughing, some crying, all carrying invisible battles. When I stepped onto the stage, the applause was thunderous, but I waited for the quiet before speaking. "My name is Monica Hayes," I began, "and I am not a miracle. I am proof that broken doesn't mean finished. That strength isn't loud, it's steady. That faith doesn't promise comfort, it promises meaning." I paused, scanning the faces, women like me, survivors all. "I lost everything once," I continued. "My husband, my home, my faith. But the thing about loss is it teaches you to value what remains. And what remained was love. Love for my children. Love for the people who believed in second chances. Love for myself, finally." I took a breath, steady and full. So if you're sitting here tonight thinking it's too late, it's not. You're just in the middle of your story. And I promise the middle is never the end. The crowd rose to their feet, and in that moment under the stage lights, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not survival, not victory. Wholeness. When I got home that night, the porch light was on. Devin was holding Evelyn, rocking her gently while Kayla laughed in the background. He looked up and said, "We waited for you, Mom." And just like that, I knew I was home. Not in the house, but in the life I'd rebuilt with both hands. As I kissed my granddaughter goodnight, she reached for my necklace, the tiny gold locket I'd kept all these years. Inside it was a photo of Calvin. I smiled. "See that, baby girl? That's where you come from, love that never quits." Outside, the stars blinked like they knew the story too, and I whispered into the quiet night, "Thank you for every ending that became a beginning." Sunrise Epilogue, a letter to you. If you're listening to my story, maybe from a kitchen, a bus seat, or a quiet room after a long day, I want you to know something. You are stronger than your losses. You are not defined by who left or what broke or how long it took you to heal. You are the miracle that keeps choosing to rise. Whatever pain you carry, let it teach you, not chain you. And when life burns everything down, don't wait for someone to rescue you. Pick up the ashes, build something new, and watch how the light finds you again. Thank you, dear listener, for walking with me through this journey, through the fire, the forgiveness, and the new morning. May your days be gentle, your family safe, and your heart at peace. With love, Monica Hayes.